Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and this is the DMS Project Omega, a headphone that is importantly not a collab product, all right? By now, you're very used to seeing reviewers' names on headphones and IEMs where the reviewer has collaborated with an existing manufacturer to bring you a product that they've tuned. Well, this is very different, and I think your expectation should be a little bit different for this. So not only is this not a collab, this is a product that DMS has designed, tuned, and built by hand himself. And that makes this a very, very different thing. The expectations that you should bring into this that are a little bit different, well, for one, is price, okay? Whereas a lot of collab products are coming in at sub 50, sub $20 even. The DMS Project Omega is not coming in that cheap. In fact, the price on this guy is $1,000. And if you want to know exactly why it's $1,000, DMS actually did a pretty interesting video where he breaks down the cost. But the basic gist of it is that he's not making that many of them, and he's making them by hand. And frankly, that's what it costs to do something like this. The other thing to expect with this thing is just that because he's making it small volumes by hand, the manufacturing capacities and manufacturing materials and stuff that they have at their disposal are going to be pretty different than what you might expect from your traditional $1,000 headphone, which is what this thing costs, okay? We'll talk about exactly the build quality and form factor and stuff like that a little bit, but just set your expectations. This thing is made out of 3D printed plastics, and to some degree, it's for the good of the headphone. But again, we'll talk about that. The other thing that's interesting about this headphone is that DMS has said he's only going to be making this thing for a year. He's basically doing it in batches where the first batch he sold, I don't know, like 4 months ago. Those units are shipping out to people now. This is one of those initial batch one units that for the past couple of weeks I've been living with and listening to, but he's also doing batch 2 pre-orders right now, at least for today and tomorrow and maybe one other day. So it's not for very long, but if you want to get in on batch 2, I've got them linked in the description down below. But of course, we got to dive into the details of this review. Anything else I wanted to talk about? One other quick note is that at the end of that 1 year, okay, that won't be exactly the last time that you can get a DMS Project Omega, but that will be the last time that you can get one that he made, because he will stop making them, stop selling them, but he will open source the designs, which is actually kind of a cool thing, which means you could ostensibly print and build your own Project Omega, but I have a feeling it wouldn't be that much cheaper than just buying it from DMS. But I digress. Let's get into it. We're going to talk about the build quality, form factor, comfort, all that stuff. We'll talk about the sound, frequency response that we get out of the DMS Project Omega, and then I'm going to bring in some other headphones and kind of show you exactly where I feel this headphone lines up in terms of build quality, in terms of sound signature, in terms of overall sound desirability. That's not exactly a word, but that's what we're going to talk about. So with that out of the way, let's dive to the table and we'll talk about what you get inside the packaging of the DMS Project Omega. Here's the box. Pretty cool big box, but not a ton in it. You get the headphone itself and you get a cable. And let's start by talking about this cable, which, you know, it's actually a pretty interesting cable. I am not a big fan. Just aesthetically, I'm not a big fan of this, but I think obviously DMS is a big fan of this. I think this is a headphone or a cable that headphones.com shop sells. And maybe this has some special meaning to them, but personally, I think it's certainly better than your average headphone cable, which can be pretty bad. I think the length on this guy is actually quite nice. I would say, I'm stretching my arms out right now. Here we go. Let's go to this cam. It's probably about like a 5-foot long cable, so a little bit longer than your average IEM cable, but a little bit shorter than your average desktop headphone cable. Kind of a nice little balance, but there we go. And then also the behavior on it is actually pretty nice. You can see it flopping around. Why I'm not the biggest fan of it is I just don't really love the aesthetic on these machined parts. But these are they seem like they're a machined aluminum, so they're nicely built. In fact, there's even texture here. Like if I'm rubbing my hand across it, I can feel the pattern carved into it, which is kind of neat. But I don't know. And then this down here is pretty chonky. This is a 6.3 mil termination. I believe this is the only termination that you can get this thing in if you buy it from headphones.com. So hopefully you like that. But if you don't like that, it does use a standard 3.5 mil dual entry. So there's going to be a lot of headphone cables that you can swap it out for and use for yourself. Personally, I actually used another headphone cable. One, because I don't love the aesthetics on this one, but also two, I'm not a 6.3 guy. I'm a 3.5 guy. Give me 3.5. I understand why it's 6.3, but anyway, you know, ostensibly you could be using this headphone on like an amplifier or something like that. Well, I guess a little bit of a spoiler, the drivability of it, it's actually pretty drivable. It doesn't require a ton of power. So you could even run this off of like a MacBook if you wanted to get nutty like that. Anyway, let's dive to talking about the headphone itself now. And this is where, I don't know, this is going to get a little bit mixed because I feel like the visual on this headphone, the term that I wrote down was, it kind of has a very iconic design. Like there is something pretty standout and unique about the design, kind of in the way it reminds me of kind of like a blown up Koss Porta Pro, right? And I mean that in a good way. Like aesthetically, there's something to that I dig. I like the simplicity of it. I like the pop of red, obviously, in it. And just that it's, again, I feel like an iconic design. Now, when you dive into the details of it, I feel like it's, you know, it certainly lacks some polish, which again is partly what you should expect for a headphone that is manufactured in small batches by hand. But nonetheless, it's going to be a thing that stands out to you. Is like if you're comparing this with the build quality of a $1,000 Focal or $1,000 Meze headphone, it's not going to stand up to that. But it's still nonetheless like there's something to the simplicity of it, like a graphic design of it that can still, I don't know, stand on its own, I suppose. But yeah, you can see, right? All this is printed out of SLS nylon. Again, I'm not a 3D printing aficionado, so that doesn't mean too much to me, but my understanding is that a nylon print is one of the more durable 3D prints that you can get out there. It's lightweight, which I guess I can talk about the weight. I weighed this thing on my scale. I think DMS's quoted weight was 300 grams. On my scale, it was actually 275 grams, which is a little bit lighter. But just to give you a sense, like this is definitely a very, very light headphone. The headband is the part that is probably like the nicest built. It's not made out of 3D printed parts. You've got, you know, some metal brackets here. You've got these rods, these adjustment rods that are very much like Odysseys or like the classic Odysseys. Or even modern Odysseys kind of do this still, right? Has nice positive clicks and stays in place. Pretty decent range on that. But the other thing that's just kind of nice and stand out about this headband is that versus some other 3D printed sort of hobbyist build headphones, it's actually got a nice bit of polish to it. Like the padding on it is quite nice. A decent amount of padding here. It's got some flex. I'm guessing this is like a steel band underneath, but I'm not totally certain. And then they've also got the DMS-D logo stamped in there, which is a nice, clever touch. So good job on the build quality of the headband. Now down here at the yokes, there's some interesting stuff going on, but also this is kind of where I would say some of my bigger peeves with the build quality on this headphone are. So what I like are these parts right here. This actually does appear to be made out of metal, which is nice. And then you can see where these yokes pin into the side of the cups, right? There's these 3 pins over here and 3 pins over here. DMS actually made the point to say that these are symmetrical, right? So the left and the right side are actually designed the same so that you could use the same part on left and right. And maybe what's more interesting to me is that, here, let me show you this. This rod can actually pull out and move down to different adjustment pins to change kind of the fit and form of the headphone, all right? So if you want the 3.5 mil connector to point forward a little bit more, you can move that to the different pin and tilt it forward, which is kind of interesting. Where I actually found that most useful is actually in, I'm going to say one of my first peeves with the build quality, which is that out of the box, this is how it comes. And I found that putting this thing on my head, there wasn't enough room for the cup to tilt, right? So basically the way that it would fit on my head is I would get a seal up top, but a big gap down below. But by moving, let's see if we can redo it again here live on camera. By pulling that pin and moving it up there, you can see that it allows a significant bit more tilt to the cup, which then imparts a better fit. Now, the other thing that is kind of notable about the yokes and this stuff is just generally how like kind of floppy this headphone is. And you might have even noticed that as I'm handling it, this is a problem that's probably worse without the cable than it is with, but you can see that the cup is upside down and it's just kind of can lose orientation a little bit. It's just, I don't know. It's a bit of a side effect of this headphone design, and also just the fact that the pads don't clamp themselves together. I feel like if there was a little bit more clamp on this thing, to the point that the pads would at least touch, just kiss each other gently, it would make it easier to hold this thing one-handed like this and have it not be flopping around. But there you go. It's just a floppy headphone. Let me punch out here just to give you a sense of like what it can look like when you're, and now I'm making a little bit of a mess of it on purpose, but also that kind of just happens when handling this headphone. Now, when it's on my head, let's throw it there, you don't have that problem. In fact, I would say this is actually a pretty nice headphone to wear in a couple of ways. So one, like I mentioned, it's made out of SLS nylon, which they was partly chose, I'm sure, because that is a material that is available to them that they can do customization on. But also it's very, very lightweight. And that is a thing that is true of this headphone versus a lot of other headphones in, especially around this price range. This is probably going to be like half the weight of your average, like 500 gram headphone. So yeah, you do get the benefit of it being lightweight. It's also, because the pads are not clamping themselves closed when the thing's on a table, it's not an especially clampy headphone. And the pads are, as you can see, and punch in on it so you can see me in full profile. The pads are quite thick and pillowy, all right? And there's not a lot of clamps. So it's just kind of like this, I don't know, very soft, lightweight, almost like you're not really wearing much kind of headphone. And if you're looking for something that you can wear for long hours at a time, I imagine this has got to be it. Now, the ear cups you can see are a little bit on the large side, and the pads themselves are also quite large, although the pads are, you can see this thickness here in the front, and I'll show you in the back, quite a bit thicker in the back. I can't show you the back of my head without me not knowing if I'm on camera. But anyway, yeah, it's generally just a nice, light, soft, pillowy fit. The ear cups themselves I find to be pretty large, not maybe the largest, like if you're used to something like a hyphen egg, it's certainly not that large, but I have no problem with the vertical height, the left to right height in terms of my ear fitting, and certainly no problem with the depth. You can see these pads are quite deep, quite deep. So generally I would say that comfort is probably the strength of this headphone, if I'm honest. The clackiness and the floppiness is the weakness of the build quality. So there's just trade-offs there. Again, some of those are just things you should expect when you're buying a product like this, but also some of those are probably some things that I imagine Doug could improve in the next version. All right, anything else I want to talk about build quality? I don't think so. So let's get into talking about the sound here on the DMS Project Omega. And to start with, let's take a look at the frequency response. Oh, that was kind of cute. All right, so here's the frequency response of the Omega as measured on my rig. If you want to take a look at this measurement, I've got it linked in the description down below. Although something that's kind of notable about this headphone is that before shipping these things out to people, they're actually measuring them and making the measurements for each individual unit available. So you can actually see what DMS's measurement is. And probably his measurement of this looks a little bit different than mine because we use different rigs, and that's normal. But here's what it looks like on my rig. So as you can see, there's this kind of generic Kemar DF target that we've got going on here in the background. And the DMS Project Omega, it do be following that target pretty well. In fact, I believe the target that DMS has explicitly said that he was aiming for was the diffuse field tilted target, right? So if you're familiar with what the headphones.com crew has been doing over, frankly, like the past 2 or 3 years, they've been doing a lot of figuring out what does diffuse field measure like on a 5128 B&K Brew & Cure rig, and then tilting it by 10 dB or 1 decibel per octave to give it a little bit more of a warm tilt versus the traditional bright sound of DF. And that is what DMS has gone with, and that is what the Kemar DF target is more or less going for as well. And as you can see, well, he kind of nailed it. All right, frequency response wise, this thing is it's doing it quite well. Some things where maybe there's a little bit of deviation. So there is a little bit of bass roll off in the back. That's kind of standard for an open back headphone, and this is an open back headphone. Apologies if I didn't mention that before. Some other notable things is you do have this fairly prominent bump here at 1000 hertz, which has, some people will describe a 1000 hertz bump as like a honk. I don't know that it necessarily comes across as honky in this particular implementation, but it does have kind of the effect of giving it a little bit of a low contrastness to like the vocal region. But you can see that the vocal region is pretty well in line with general targets, and then the treble also seems more or less in line with the target. So graph-wise, this thing's doing pretty stinking good, but how does it actually sound to my ear? Well, let me pull up my notes real quick, all right? The first things that stand out to me is that it does sound very, very normal, okay? Tuning-wise, this thing sounds natural, it sounds normal, which is kind of what you would expect of something that is tuned to an HRTF type frequency response target like the diffuse field target there. But notably, I would actually say that this thing sounds different than what I would expect from that graph, especially if I'm looking at other headphones that I have graphed on my same rig versus that target. The Project Omega to me actually sounds a little bit thinner than I would expect, and also a little bit brighter. And now the brightness in this thing is not like a spiky, sharp treble type of brightness. It's just kind of like an even keeled, I don't want to say a lift in the treble, but it just has like, again, like this, a little bit of thinness in the lower mid range, which I think is what is contributing to the overall sound, just kind of feeling that's a little bit tilted more bright. So if I'm listening to this compared to, let's say, the Sennheiser HD600, and we'll pull that in for a comparison in a little bit, this to me sounds actually a little bit brighter and thinner, and not so much like rich, a little bit more clinical and clean sounding versus something like the HD600, right? Just to kind of put this thing into perspective. Again, I think the tonality in this thing sounds perfectly natural, perfectly normal, and like it's not going to sound weird with vocals or anything like that. But it does have more of that clinical sound to it versus a rich, warm sound. And that kind of surprised me, that versus what I saw on the graph, and frankly, what I was kind of expecting from what I understand of DMS's preferences. But there you go. Anything else? Okay. If I'm like playing around with EQ in this thing, and I did, that's kind of what I really wanted to figure out. I was like, okay, I'm surprised that this thing sounds a little bit thinner than I'm expecting. How can I make it sound more in line with what I'm expecting? So step one, I did pull down that 1000 hertz little bump in there, right? Like -2, -3 dB or something like that. It's a pretty small EQ adjustment, but it does make a noticeable difference, and it does fill out the mid-range a little bit. Even though you're kind of pulling something down, what it has the effect of is just giving you a little bit more emphasis on the upper mid-range and a little bit less emphasis on that little narrow range. And that gives it a little bit more contrast and a little bit more weight. But more importantly, the change that I made was actually adding, and this is weird because this is not the type of EQ change I would normally make, but just adding kind of a wideband +1.5, maybe even 2 dB at around, what did I do? 100 hertz? Oh, 200 hertz. All right. 200 hertz is like straight in the mud range, which is normally not where I would be putting stuff in, but adding a little bit to this, in my mind, to my ear, just kind of, it gave it that body and that richness that I feel like it does lack a little bit out of the box. Yeah. Now, the one thing that is standout on this headphone, even without EQ, all right, you don't have to worry about EQ for this aspect of it, is the imaging in the head stage. Actually quite good. Again, compared to something like the Sennheiser HD600, which is certainly not known for its sound stage. This definitely blows it away in terms of that, like really good separation between sounds. You get this really precise sense of sounds coming from specific positions. It does that actually really, really well. The bass on this thing is actually also really well defined. Even with my EQ, it still sounds defined, even though I'm giving it kind of that mud EQ. It still sounds nice and defined in its attack. It's snappy, but it does have kind of a sense of, I don't, a fast decay is, I guess, the common parlance. It just doesn't feel like it reverberates and gives you kind of that satisfying rumble in the way that, I don't know, maybe like a Hyphen Edition XS or something like that will. But you do get, again, a snappy bass attack, and it does feel more prominent in the mix than it does on your typical Sennheiser headphone. So, okay, let's actually bring in more of these headphones for direct comparison and kind of rank these in maybe some unique ways, but let's talk about it. And it looks like I do not have enough room on my table to quite orient these in order. So we're going to have to use our imaginations a little bit. But the headphones that I have on the table, obviously the DMS Project Omega. Here I've actually got the Sennheiser HD58X. I'm treating this as kind of a stand-in for the 6XX because I don't own the 6XX, but I do own the HD600, which we've got on the table. And we've also got the Meze 109 Pro. Now, these are all on the table kind of for their own reasons, right? The HD600, this is just my go-to standard. This is what I compare almost everything to because I stinking love this headphone. Even though it's a lot cheaper than this headphone, it's 300 bucks. It's still kind of my standard because it's cheaper than most headphones, and frankly, I like it better than most headphones. The reason that the 58X is on the table is, one, because it gives us a nice kind of gradation in some of these comparisons, but also, again, I don't have the 6XX, which a lot of people compare with, or I know that DMS is a big fan of the 6XX. I would say that this is kind of like the brighter, more neutral version versus the 6XX. 6XX is a little bit warmer. The 58X is a step warmer than that, just to orient yourselves. And then finally, we've got the Meze 109 Pro, which is up here because price range, this guy's much closer to the DMS Project Omega. This thing's like 800 bucks, I believe. And frankly, one of the best built headphones I've ever seen at any price range. Okay. All right, let's rank these things in terms of weight. Let's start with weight. And let's start with the lowest. In fact, all of these headphones are actually pretty lightweight. But just to orient yourself and again, put it into perspective, both of the Sennheiser headphones on my scale are around 230 grams, right? Very lightweight. The DMS Project Omega would be next lightest behind those at 275 grams. And then finally, we have the Meze 109 Pro, which is still, again, quite lightweight for what you get here, but it is coming in at 330 grams. So weight-wise, this is, I don't know, let's say like 20% more than this, and then this is like maybe 15% more than these. All of them quite lightweight, but just to kind of put that into perspective. Now, in terms of build quality and like just lovability, I'm gonna rank them a little bit different, all right? The 109 Pro is clearly the nicest build of these headphones. Let me throw it on my head just to kind of show you. Oh, it's gorgeous. It's got the wood. It looks fantastic. It feels very comfortable. This is definitely the best built headphone here on the bunch. Next up, I would probably say is kind of, well, it's probably the Sennheiser HD600. The 58X feels a little bit cheaper in the plastics, but more or less feels frankly the same. This is just kind of, you know, a good basic plastic build headphone. And then finally, in the end, I would say is probably the DMS Project Omega. Durability wise, it actually feels pretty decent. Like I don't worry about it there. It's just, you know, doesn't have quite the fit and finish of a production headphone, but that's kind of what you have to expect going into something like this. Now, let's talk about how these things compare in terms of sound. And the first kind of place that I want to rank these things in, just to, again, orient yourself, is brightness, okay? The brightest headphone on this table is this guy, the Meze 109 Pro, like not even close. And what's interesting is it's not even necessarily like the overall tilt of the sound. It's just got kind of like peaky, bright treble that is very standouty and maybe gives it kind of like a pluckiness that's almost planar-like, which these other headphones really don't have. But it can also be, frankly, pretty annoying. At the very bottom end of the brightness scale, I would say, is the 58X. This thing's kind of warm. You might even call it a little bit warm poo in terms of the sound. It's just a little bit thick, muted in the treble, but I don't know, still pleasant in its own way. And then in the middle, I would say that the Project Omega, I already talked about this a little bit when I was talking about the sound signature. This is, to me, sounds actually a little bit brighter than the HD600. Again, to orient yourself kind of in this scale, if the 6XX was on the table, right, the 6XX would probably be in between the 58X and the HD600. So to me, the Project Omega sounds like kind of like 2 stages brighter and thinner versus the 6XX. That was the end of the sentence. I didn't need to keep going. All right. The other thing I wanted to talk about is in terms of like spatial effects. Okay. And in terms of spatial effects, frankly, like these two are pretty competitive. I think that maybe there's a slight edge to the spatial effects. Again, just sounding like it's got a bigger sound stage, really strong imaging, maybe a slight benefit to the Meze 109 Pro. Again, probably because of that exaggerated treble, which can be a problem in its own right. But it does nonetheless give it a nice, good sense of space and good sense of definition and separation between sounds. The Omega is frankly not far behind it, and it doesn't have any of that peaky treble. It's just that it is still a brighter sound signature, but it's a lot more balanced in terms of its treble execution. And for that, you get a nice wide head stage. And then behind that, you might think that I would say that these two are about the same, but no, not really. I think that the HD600, definitely not a head stagey headphone, but versus something like the 58X, which is again, a little bit on the warm poo sound. This thing is just really kind of congested and closed. This one goes kind of far in the distance. In fact, both of these, I would say, are fairly far in the distance of these two in terms of those spatial effects. So if that's what you're looking for, there you go. But in terms of my overall preference in terms of sound, this is where it gets a little bit tricky. Well, my overall preference is not that tricky. It's still going to be the HD600. My least favorite, frankly, is probably going to be the 109 Pro, just because that treble is kind of irritating and I can't tolerate it that long. And then in between these two, frankly, it's a little bit of a mix because these are like on either side of where I want my ideal sound signature, right? The Project Omega is a little bit on the thin, a little bit bright, but again, not like in the strident sense. It's just a little bit thinner, more clinical sounding versus the HD600, which has a little bit of that warmth and body and thickness to vocals that I like. The 58X is a little bit too much, and maybe quite a bit too much of that body and thickness of the vocals that I like, but it's still nonetheless like a fairly enjoyable headphone, especially at its price range. But I would say that these two, again, they're just like on either side of my ideal sound signature. Now, with the Omega, you definitely get that wider sound, whereas this gives you kind of that congested, boxy sound. But I don't know. Hopefully that helps you put this thing into perspective. All right, I'm checking my notes. Nothing else I want to talk about. So let me move these to the side. HD600, you're out of here for now. And let's dive to the table and give this thing a score. All right. The DMS Project Omega, out of 5 stars, I'm going to give this thing 3 stars. All right. I think this thing sounds quite good. I think he's done a good job with the design of it. Again, it's like kind of this iconic design that I think people are definitely going to be remembering years from now. And I really like the idea that he's building this thing for a year and then he's going to open source the designs. I think that's really cool. In terms of sound, like it's very good. It's impressive in terms of its spatial effects and stuff like that. And the tonality is quite good. Better than, frankly, a lot of headphones that come from giant manufacturers. So that's pretty impressive. But if I'm being honest, like it does still come across a little bit on the thin side. It lacks a little bit of that body and richness that I really love in my sound. And the build quality is, again, you have to have certain expectations with it, but I do wish that it was a little bit less floppy and a little bit more solid. So that's why, for me, this is a 3 out of 5 headphones. Very impressive that Doug was able to do this thing. And if you're interested in checking this thing out, if you want your own DMS Project Omega, I've got them linked in the description down below. Or you can wait a year and 3D print it yourself. But again, I don't think that's going to save you much money. But yeah, that's going to do it for this review. If you found it helpful, if you liked it, please do hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, and I'll catch you on the next super review. Cheers.
Join with the force of reviews, we now have the tools to brave the misleading world of audio fools. Hey, this review is super, and so are you. Grab your headphones, sniff a graph, and share your thoughts in this pursuit. Let's get with the pitch, collective